NATO's Secretary General is in Ottawa right now meeting with Stephen Harper and the Ministers of Defense and Foreign Affairs. The military alliance is seeking more support for Ukraine's military to help it hold off pro-Russian fighters in the country's east. The other big issue, expanding Canada's role in the fight against ISIS. Expect to hear more about the Prime Minister's plans as the House gets back to work today. For more on what an extended and expanded mission might look like, I'm joined by Bessma Momani in Waterloo, Ontario. She's a senior fellow with the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And here in the studio, I'm with Brian Stewart. He's a former CBC News Senior Correspondent and currently a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Hello to you both. Hi. Brian, let me ask you, what do you think about your initial thoughts on Canada's mission in Iraq? Should it be extended?
Well, there's no question at all it will be extended, because how can a government turn around and, having said ISIS is at war with Canada, it's a major threat to Canada, and we're going to go over and fight against this major threat against Canada and the world, and then say 6 months should do us fine or 9 months should do us fine, now we're going to pull out. It was really inevitable from the beginning it would be extended, and I think it is going to be extended several times down the road. As to in which way it gets extended, that's where I think the debate's going to be most fiercely around now. And
Bessma, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the mission has to be extended. I think it has to be expanded as well. But really, and this is a huge caveat, to ensure that this mission is actually successful, we need to address the political problem. The political problem remains, which is that much of the Sunni communities are disgruntled, that they may liberate areas against ISIS, but what's coming in its place? Are they going to be Shia militias or a sectarian-led government in Baghdad that's just going to really further alienate and disenfranchise many of the Sunni population? So the political argument or the political equation or part of this equation has not been settled and is a really important part of defeating the long-term defeat of ISIS.
I agree with that very much. Not only is it an incredibly complex political situation, but militarily it's going to get much more complex pretty soon, I think. The battle for Tikrit and the oncoming battle of Mosul, maybe well into this year, is going to bring the war into a much more urbanized struggle phase. Now, Canada has been launching bombing missions basically over rural territories right now. But as the war gets more complicated, both for political and military reasons, then what Canada is going to do, what it decides not to do, what it decides it can't really afford to do, is going to come much more to the fore.
Bessma, what do you make of the government's transparency when it comes to what it is that Canada is actually doing over there?
Well, I think we need more transparency, obviously, based on the limitations of not giving away too much of our security here. But, you know, I think the Canadian public thirsts for that. They want that, particularly in light of so much skepticism in the previous Iraq mission of the Americans in 2003. And I think that's why the Harper government is so committed to at least bringing this to Parliament, even though we all know it doesn't need to be in front of Parliament to convince the Canadian people, nor will it necessarily have to go to a vote because they have the majority. But I think the optics here is important. I'm glad they're doing this, but I hope what we do in this mission is follow through on the NATO's, or I should say the coalition's 7-point commitment to fighting ISIS, which must include the political equation. We really have to think about, okay, fine, we defeat ISIS, we bring in a so-called Iraqi government into power in places like Tikrit and then soon in Mosul. But what happens the day after when we have to leave? If we leave in a very sectarian government, we're going to see the rise of ISIS yet again.
I also think the government has to be really frank, that much more so than it was, say, in Afghanistan, about the fact that this is a very dangerous mission. There's no way to avoid that, and it could be a very, very long mission. All the problems outlined, military and much more to the point, political, of course, could take years to basically get to even really firmly to grips with. I mean, ISIS, I think, is being stalled. It's being pushed back. That could be a very long-term era, and we could be looking at several years down the road. That should be stated right up front, I think, by the government.
And so, Brian, we should talk about the expansion. We don't know yet whether or not this expansion is going to push Canada into Syria, but that certainly seems to be what a lot of people are expecting.
Yes,
what do you think?
Indeed. Some of the talk about the Syrian option may be taking attention away from what we still have to work out about the Iraq option, so we got to be careful here. I think in Syria, Canada has only two really incredible military options here. It can't just simply go in with F-18s and F-18s and bomb around Syria. It has to, if it does use the 18s, it has to use them very selectively. And I think it could only use them in the eastern part of the country, where basically the government and the main civil war is not being conducted. I think, though, the more realistic option that it will pick, if it picks anything, is reconnaissance planes. I think that's an area where Canada, without dropping anything, can do a lot of perhaps useful work for the Allies. And I think that's what Harper might go for.
And Bessma, is it a problem that Canada, if it does go into Syria, has not been invited in by the Assad government?
I mean, by international law, yes, in some way. That said, Americans and other Arab allies have already been very active in Syria, around Raqqa, around Kobani, and helping the Kurds. So they've already been in the field, if you will. But yeah, Canada obviously has always historically wanted to comply with UN Security Council resolutions. We don't have one in this particular case, in contrast to Iraq, where we were invited by the central government. So there is a legality component here. But that said, I mean, I hope what we do in expanding into Syria, which I think is going to eventually be the case, particularly after Iraq is secured, is the question of responsibility to protect. 220,000 people have been killed in Syria, but not by ISIS. And this is where things get really complicated, but by the Assad regime. And the big question here, just as we have in Iraq, if we get rid of ISIS in Syria, are we basically empowering Assad to take over? Will we actually be shooting ourselves in the foot by actually making Assad now strengthened in the now eastern part